Welcome everyone to this year's Cal OER meeting. We're very excited for the next 2.5 days of OER extravaganza. The theme of our meeting was Beyond the Horizon, Challenges and Opportunities of Scaling Open Education. As many of us have recognized over the community, open ed is evolving in a variety of different ways, and it's important in order to be able to recognize where it's going, and especially in the state with the significant investment of building open educational resources. It's important in order to recognize the scaling opportunities and issues and growing pains that's necessary in order to be able to advance it in our state. So just let's go through a few housekeeping things before we start to transition into our keynote speaker. Can we move to the next slide? Um, the organizing committee for this conference consists of approximately 8 people that are on here, ranging from all three of the primary intersegmental upper divisional or upper or post-secondary education systems in the state, the University of California, Cal State University system, and the California Community College system. Uh, I want to thank our sponsors. We received a significant amount of funding and support from the Open Education Resource Initiative from the California Community College, specifically the Academic Senate, the Mickelson 20 Million Minds Foundation, California State University's Affordable Learning Solution, and LibreText. Uh, Also want to thank you in part for your registration fees, which is important in order to maintain the sustainability of our projects. The contributions from both the fees and from the sponsors makes this event possible and enables Cal OER to offer live captioning, which is available on all our meetings. We're pleased to provide the live captioning through the partnership with AI Media. All sessions will have a live captionist available, and users may simply enable closed captioning by toggling on captions within the platform. Feel free to share what you're learning. If anything actually resonates with you that you want to shout out from the rooftops. We have a hashtag Cal OER 2025 that you can use on your favorite or not so favorite social media platform. On Twitter, we have a conference at Cal OER, and here's our website that's on there. Just some basic principles of operation. Make sure you mute yourself when you come into the room. And if you're not already muted, we encourage the chat for all conversations, and then we can move into more live discussions after that. If there's time for question and answer for any of the sessions, please raise your hand and unmute when called upon. And recorded sessions will be available on the Zoom events platform for 7 months after the event. You'll be notified when the recordings are live, but we expect them to be available at the end of next week. And then selected general sessions, specifically the keynote for today, which I'm about to introduce, systems updates, and will be available on our Cal OER YouTube channel, and the URL is there. The only thing that I may mention here, which is actually important for the discussion of tomorrow's keynote, is because the sensitive nature of the topic at hand, which is addressing that's the topic at hand for the OER keynote panel, that's not going to be recorded in order to be able to avoid potential repercussions that may happen for the individuals that might be saying things publicly that don't jive with certain um, sensibilities in other places of the country. So next slide. And with that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. David Wiley. He's a visionary leader and one of the foundational figures of the open educational movement. David was the co-founder of Lumen Learning. He was an education fellow at the Creative Commons, and up to 2012, he was an adjunct faculty member in instructional psychology and technology at Brigham Young University. Just a few months ago, he transitioned back into academia as an associate professor of marketing, MIS, and entrepreneurship at Marshall University. Throughout his career, David has been a tireless advocate for educational access, affordability, and equity. He is a prolific author of over 285 articles and cited blog entries. His influence can be seen across many dimensions of the open educational community. For example, he's coined the term, he coined the original term of open content. He's played a critical role in shaping early development of Creative Commons and developed the widely accepted or widely adopted 5R framework: retain, reuse, revise, remixing, and redistribution, which forms the backbone of open educational resources. Through his scholarship, public leadership, and unwavering commitment to openness, he has empowered educators and institutions around the world to imagine the possibilities of teaching and learning. David was the founder and for 16 years the chief organizer of the Open Ed Conference, and which is a key gathering place for the global open ed community. Today, David will challenge us to think beyond the conventional use of technology in education with a talk that explores the intersection of open education and generative AI. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Wiley.
Thank you, Dr. Delmar Larson, for that intro. I appreciate that. It really is, it's an honor to be invited to speak anytime, but with a group as big and doing as much work as you guys are doing in California, I'm doubly grateful for the invitation. So thanks for the chance to be here and to share some thoughts today. Of course, this presentation is an OER. It's licensed CC BY. Everybody in this room probably knows what that means. I'll have a QR code on the last slide where you can download the slides to revise and remix them and do all the things that you like to do, should you want to do that. So I want to begin with a prelude, falling in love with the problem. We have a saying in entrepreneurship that it's critically important to fall in love with the problem and not your solution. And I want to take you through one of the canonical examples of this here. So all of us have a problem of needing a way to keep food cold and drinks cold and sometimes medication and other things that we need to keep cold. We want to keep them cold. And for a long time, the way that that was done was we harvested ice from frozen lakes and then shipped it to customers' homes. With some advances in technology, we reached a point where we could actually make ice industrially, make it locally, and just do home delivery that way. Same problem, new solution, enabled by some new technology. And again, later on, same problem, another new solution. Now, instead of making ice industrially and delivering it to homes, today, we all have in-home refrigerators and freezers. So the problem stays the same over time, but as new technologies, new techniques become available, we're able to solve those problems in better, more effective, more efficient kinds of ways. And so if you fall in love with the problem, if you're really in love with the idea of finding a way to help people keep things cold, then you're always able to leverage new innovations to solve that problem more effectively and more efficiently. However, if you fall in love with your solution to the problem, then eventually you'll be left behind. You might imagine that the people who were involved in the industrial making of ice knew a thing or two about the kinds of equipment, machinery, maintenance that it takes to create and store ice. But because those people were locked into their vision of centralized creation and distribution, they missed the opportunity to transition into in-home refrigerators and freezers, even though they arguably knew more about that technology than anyone else did and were best poised to make those kinds of machines and put them in people's homes. But instead of being in love with the problem and trying to help people solve the problem, they were in love with their solution. And so they got passed by when new technology came along. And I shared this just as a prelude to the rest of the talk to think about the problem that I think we all originally were in love with. Me from 1998, you from whenever you became associated with the open education movement. And that problem being that too many people lack access to educational opportunities that can make their lives more meaningful, provide them with greater financial stability, improve their overall health and well-being, allow them to contribute more fully to society, and a range of other things. There's not enough access to these meaningful, important educational opportunities. And if we stay in love with that problem, instead of falling in love with a specific solution, we're going to be able to look at new opportunities that come available to solve this problem in more efficient and more effective ways. And that's a little foreshadowing for the rest of the talk. So let's talk about this work that we've been doing for, I'm going to say 27 years now, of increasing access. A quick sketch of ways that we've tried to increase access to educational opportunity. Distributing educational materials by mail goes back hundreds of years. Um, I think the consensus is that this shorthand course created by Caleb Phillips is the first example of kind of a correspondence course that we are aware of. In 1937, Chicago Public Schools started offering courses by radio during a pandemic response, which all of us have had some experience with recently. In the 50s, University of Houston starts airing courses via public television. Like over the years, we've tried to use different technologies as they've come available to extend the reach of educational opportunity, mostly by making access to materials available in these different ways. Obviously, Caleb Phillips in his first course by mail, he wasn't accepting homework, providing feedback on that. It was just a blast out of materials, educational materials. Obviously, radio is one way, television is one way. Um, we've really tried to increase access by giving more people access to the materials supporting that. Now, there's relatively little progress, relatively compared to today, little progress made before the 1990s because publishing and broadcasting are both expensive and complicated, or used to be expensive and complicated. If you can remember all the way back to the 1980s and what it would have taken to create a book, what it would have taken to create a nationally syndicated radio show or television program, um, very expensive and very complicated. But the advent of the internet democratizes publishing. It makes it so that anyone can publish what they're thinking. And eventually democratizes broadcasting as well, because now we have YouTube, we have podcasts, we have things that look like television or movies and radio that we're broadcasting over the internet as well. So these activities go from being very expensive and complicated to being dramatically less expensive and easier to do. For me personally, just to give you a little kind of background on myself, I can still remember very clearly. I was sitting in my office, actually here at Marshall University, where I was an undergraduate. Um, I was the first university webmaster, and I was working on the website one day, and I was creating a calculator in JavaScript that I was going to embed into a web page on our site. And I remember realizing the difference between this JavaScript calculator and the kinds of calculators that we had access to at my elementary school, where there maybe weren't a sufficient number of calculators for everyone to have one. So you had to wait your turn for it to come around. Um, Competition maybe isn't the right word, but you kind of had to compete for access to resources because they were limited and scarce, and there were more of us than there were of them. But once this calculator was created in a web page, 1 million people could use that calculator at the same time. And it seemed like this difference between physical objects and digital objects was really powerful and really important. Now, of course, I was not the first person to think about that. Economists have a word and a set of vocabulary for talking about these differences between digital and physical resources. But when the news is printed on paper, I can't be reading one section as long as my wife is reading it. I have to wait for her to finish. But if that same news is published online, 1 million people can all read it at the same time. And so this new affordance of digital media seemed to be really important to me. And because millions of people could use them at the same time, that meant that you could share with each other in ways that we've never shared before. In terms of like music, before the internet, you might create mixtapes for friends or boyfriends or girlfriends and share them that way. But with the internet, with Napster and things that came afterward, it became super easy to share music online. And lots of people did that for a certain period of time until it was made abundantly clear to all of us by a cadre of lawyers that just because sharing is possible and is easy does not mean that it's legal. And that turned out to be true for much more than just music, because the Berne Convention, which I think is a on everyone's bingo card when they hear me talk, I always find a way to talk about the Berne Convention. When the US became a signatory to Berne, copyright law changed in an important and terrible way. Before we became signatories to Berne, if you created something that you wanted to copyright and protect, you registered that work with the Copyright Office. After Berne, the moment you created anything that contained a certain level of kind of creativity and authorship, the moment it was fixed in some format, it was fully copyrighted to the fullest extent of the law. Whether you wanted that protection, needed that protection, didn't want that protection, didn't matter. Everything's automatically fully copyrighted, which makes it pretty hard to share things with each other and say, hey, take this, take that. You know, I created the syllabus, I created this chapter. Um, Go ahead and do whatever you want to do with it. Well, it's fully copyrighted to the same extent, as Catcher in the Rye or as Harry Potter or something else. So now we need ways to legally share with each other. So in 98, in early 98, if you were alive and paying attention back then, you might remember, is when the words open source software were first said back in February of 98, as a way of describing some of the work that had been happening with software where the source code was freely available for anyone to take and use and modify. Up to that point, it had been called free software. But free has all kinds of confusions about, do you mean free like I'm free to do anything I want to do, or free as in it's not going to cost me anything? So a group of people got together and decided, let's try calling it open source software instead and see if that doesn't communicate our message a little more clearly. And I was inspired by that and said, well, okay, they're doing open software, um, but for educational purposes, we could do something else. We could do open content. And so I created a website and went on what was kind of the social media of the time. This is a screenshot from Slashdot, and started trying to advocate for this idea that we could create copyright licenses like the open source software licenses for things that weren't software, for things that were content, um, documentation, how-tos, textbooks, essays, things like that. And so in 1998, then released the first of these licenses, the Open Content Principles and License, which did not do super well in terms of uptake. But then in 1999, I worked with Eric Raymond on the Open Publication License, which did quite well. There are a number of commercial books like from publishers like O'Reilly, Sam's, other places that were published under the Open Publication License. Um, and then the GFDL came along in 2000, and then in 2002 we get the first Creative Commons licenses. And so this idea that we can create open source style licenses for content started to really take off. And the goal here is that the internet made sharing easy, but we needed some way to make that sharing legal. So if the internet makes sharing easy, then open licenses make sharing legal, and particularly make it very easy to share things legally, right? Instead of working with a lawyer to create your own boutique license every time you want to share something, you just plug into this Creative Commons infrastructure, and now it's super easy to legally share things online. So skipping ahead, 27 years later, um, there are over 2.5 billion works that have been published online under an open license. Um, Now, not all of those are educational works, but many of them are. But this idea of openly licensing and sharing has really taken off. And in US higher ed, for example, these data are from the Open Syllabus Project. And when you download the slides, the references and things are all in the slide notes, the attributions as well for photos and things like that. In US higher ed in 2013, what the Open Syllabus Project refers to as OER textbooks were being used in about 1 in 400 classes. Um, and a decade later, that number was about 1 in 50. So obviously, there's been a lot of uptake of this idea of OER in informal learning settings. I mean, there's no way to know, but OER have been accessed billions of times. How many billions of times have they been accessed? You'd have to combine a lot of site access data from a lot of websites, but clearly a huge impact has been had on informal learners as well. Um, Several years ago, through my work with Lumen, I started getting this kind of feeling like a pit in my stomach that just increasing access isn't enough. And if you start looking at data, the Department of Education has historically collected data about graduation rates within 150% time. So in this case, what percentage of people graduate from a 4-year degree program within 6 years, within 150% of the time it's supposed to take? And you can see that these rates um, are not fabulous. And if we do that same 150% measure in 2-year programs, what percentage of people graduate from a 2-year program within 3 years? It's just abysmal. And it's not because we're not trying hard. It's not because we're not doing all the things that we can do. It's just, it's really bad as you look at that. And so I started worrying about my focus, the focus of my work being only on access, being like, well, same success rates, but now this is more accessible. And I felt like just wasn't, that wasn't enough. I wanted to do more than just increase accessibility. I wanted to start trying to improve outcomes as well. Now you might say, well, but wait, adopting OER improves outcomes. No, it doesn't. It does not. It is true that there are dozens of studies, and I will raise my own hand here, including some studies that I co-authored earlier in my career that show that adopting OER improves student outcomes. But if you go back and critically analyze these studies, including some of mine, you'll see that they suffer from some pretty serious methodological problems, particularly a lack of appropriate controls. So I want to talk about the problems with OER research for just a minute. There's a terrific paper by a team from OpenStax in 2019. Phil Grimaldi was still there, and he was the lead author here, addressing what they called the access hypothesis. And so I've got just a couple of brief quotes from this paper. So the primary goal of OER is to offer an alternative to commercial textbooks that are comparable in quality, but free and openly licensed. This is a quote from the paper. Assuming an OER textbook is no different in quality, then there are no meaningful differences to explain effects on learning outcomes. License and costs certainly should not affect learning at the cognitive level. Okay, so if OER really are just the same as other educational materials, just free and openly licensed, then a priori, we wouldn't expect there to be any differences in learning from that perspective. But then they go on to say the price of a textbook can afford whether a student decides to purchase, and a student cannot learn from a textbook they do not have. Thus, adoption of OER would be effective as a learning intervention because it ensures that all students have access to the textbook and would therefore result in better learning outcomes. We refer to this idea as the access hypothesis. So access hypothesis is in the name of the paper. And again, the paper reference is in the notes here, which you can grab afterward. The access hypothesis predicts that an OER intervention should only affect a subset of students, specifically those who would not otherwise have access to the textbook. Okay, so think about that for a minute. We've seen lots of, now, obviously I've strayed from the quote here for a moment. We've seen survey data out of Florida and out of other places that suggest that, 50, 60, 70% of students have at some point forgone purchasing a textbook because of the cost of the textbook. But they're not foregoing buying every textbook, right? Most students somehow figure out how to get access to the materials that they need. And this is the point that Grimaldi and Rich Baranick and the other authors on this paper are making. Students who are willing or able to purchase a textbook should not be affected, right? People who are going to have access to the textbook anyway don't have any learning benefit from OER. But OER efficacy research typically compares the entire sample of students who received the OER intervention to the entire sample of students who did not. So we compare the OER class versus the not OER class, and we look for differences when, in fact, in a section of 50, there may have only been 4, 5, maybe 6 students in the OER section that wouldn't have purchased and had access to the material. So you're really trying to draw out the effect on a small handful of students out of a large group. Or back to the paper, quote, to draw an analogy, the current research approach in OER is the equivalent of measuring the effect of a pain-relieving drug on a sample of people who are mostly not in pain. Now, remember, they're talking about the learning perspective here, not talking about whether they're in financial pain or not, but the effect that OER adoption should have on their learning. If they were going to get access to those materials in one way or another by purchasing them or sharing with a friend or whatever that might have been, then the OER is not as big a benefit to them as we might have thought that it would be. So if the impact of OER is measured across an entire sample of students, and again, this is another quote from the paper, it's necessary for researchers to consider the textbook access rates prior to implementation of OER so that you know what kind of effect you're looking for. Are you thinking that 5 people in your class out of 50 are maybe going to have better learning outcomes because you've adopted OER? It's certainly not 50 out of 50, right? If you believe that access to the materials is the mechanism that's improving their outcomes. So that's, I would wager that you have never read a research paper about the effectiveness of OER that either measured or estimated textbook access rates in those classrooms prior to the implementation and the study being conducted. It's basically not done, but it's a critical foundational assumption that's being made about that kind of research. Um, Two other controls that we typically fail in OER research to leverage or to make use of. The first is the instructor impact. And I would just ask you, which has a bigger impact on student learning, their instructor or the textbook chosen by their instructor? And of course, the person makes a bigger difference than a textbook does for a whole bunch of reasons that I hope are clear to everybody. In most studies, the instructors who are teaching the classes get to choose themselves whether or not to adopt OER. There's no randomization. There's typically no matching done, like with propensity score matching or something like that. There's no control for the impact or the effect of the teacher. So that makes it literally impossible to separate the influence of the instructor from the influence of either the OER or the traditionally copyrighted materials. The instructor and the materials are perfectly confounded, and you cannot distinguish the difference of impact from one to the other. So when you read a study that does not control or randomize assignment or propensity score match or do something else to control for the instructor impact, is that study telling us that students that use OER perform better than students that use TCM? Or is it telling us that students who take classes from the kinds of instructors that would adopt OER perform better than students who take classes from other kinds of instructors? And the way most studies are designed, there's literally no way to know. We can't tell if the effect that we're seeing is an effect of choosing OER or it's an effect of the instructors in one group being meaningfully different from the instructors in another group. And the final one here I'll say here is instructional design. Most studies tell us literally nothing about the course materials that are being studied, except their copyright licenses. And instructional design can account for huge differences in learning, right? So are we comparing students who are reading a printed textbook in one group to students who are using an adaptive system with infinite practice and real-time feedback that's diagnosing their problems for them? The difference between those two things is definitely going to wash out whether they were open or copyrighted or not. Are we comparing students in the class where a faculty member is using publisher-provided PowerPoints to lecture to students in another class where that instructor is using publisher-provided active learning exercises in the class? If we aren't told about those differences in instructional design, there's literally no way to know what's going on. When a study tells me it's comparing OER to TCM, it could be that one of those is using a printed textbook and traditional lecture, and the other is using an adaptive system and lots of active learning in class. But it doesn't tell me. So there's literally no way for me to know what's going on. Does a study like that tell me that students that use OER outperform the students who use TCM? Or does it tell me that students who use course materials designed according to evidence-based practices perform better than students who don't? And again, the way that most studies are reported, there's literally no way to know. So I just suggest, there are three questions for you to ask anytime you read a piece of OER efficacy research. And if you have a couple of pieces that you really like and you enjoy citing, especially if you've ever thought about giving them to policymakers, I'd encourage you to go back and look at them again from the lens of these three questions. First, have researchers measured or estimated the proportion of students who would have had no access to course materials before? And if they did they control for it in some way? Two, have researchers explained how assignment to treatment and control groups worked? If the assignment wasn't random, have they used some kind of matching or another technique to control for differences across groups of instructors? And three, have the researchers described the instructional designs of the course materials that are being compared to one another? And I'd suggest to you that if the answer to any of those questions is no, the research doesn't tell you anything particularly useful. And for the overwhelming majority of the OER efficacy research that I have read, the answer to all three questions is no. So if we want to do more than just increase access, if we want to improve outcomes, and we want to try to demonstrate that we're improving outcomes, we really have to up our game on the research side to control for some of these huge threats to validity of our research. There are a handful of what I'd consider really rigorous studies, large scale, good controls, appropriate, hierarchical analyses. And those studies almost universally show no significant difference of adopting OER compared to adopting TCM. And links to a bunch of those studies are available in the references on the notes. So how do we go from increasing access to improving outcomes? I think we're doing a pretty good job of increasing access over the last quarter century. We've definitely increased access, but how can we start improving outcomes? If we're thinking about it from the perspective of the course materials, which the OER movement, OER are course materials, right? We'll talk about pedagogy in a minute. But if you think about things from the perspective of the course materials, um, all that you can really do is change the instructional design of the materials, right? With a printed textbook or even a static textbook online, you can read, you can highlight, you can reread. But those are some of the least effective ways that you can spend time to study. There are decades of rigorous research looking at adaptive systems like intelligent tutoring systems that say that those can, not that they automatically will, but when they're properly designed, that they can dramatically improve student learning. Adaptive systems do things like adapt their instruction in response to learner performance, provide this real-time feedback I was talking about a minute ago, remediation based on that feedback. They change in response to emotional or motivational cues. But of course, as you might imagine, these kinds of systems are way more expensive and complicated to create than traditional textbooks are. Now, hang on a second, because Being far more expensive and complicated sounds like something that we heard on a slide just a minute ago when we were talking about increasing access back in the 90s. There hadn't been a lot of publishing and broadcasting activity prior to the advent of the internet because those were too expensive and complicated to do. But then the advent of the internet democratized publishing and broadcasting. And then when you add open licenses into that mix, it really democratizes sharing. I want to suggest to you that there's been relatively little progress made to date with adaptive systems because they're so expensive and complicated to create, but that the advent of generative AI democratizes the creation of adaptive systems. Not the same kind of adaptive systems that we've seen in the past. They're going to look a little different, but they are adaptive systems that have all those characteristics that I was talking about a moment ago. And when I say democratize, what I mean is, I don't know if you've heard some version of this quote. Um, this quote, Andre is the person I can find saying it the earliest, that the hottest new programming language is English, right? It's not Python or Ruby or Go or Rust or one of those other programming languages. But when you're working with generative AI, you do the programming by writing words. And writing words is something that all of us know how to do. Granted, you need some expertise in a subject matter. You definitely need expertise in instructional design. It really helps if you know something about how learning, like the psychology of how learning happens. But sitting down to write a prompt that is going to create an adaptive educational experience for a student um, is dramatically easier, faster, simpler, less complicated today than it was 5 years ago because the hottest new programming language is English. So let's talk for a minute about how generative AI increases access. Hopefully this one is kind of obvious. I love the Drake equation. If you're not familiar with the Drake equation, it's this kind of funnel that talks about the probability that we'll ever find life on other planets. So it starts with um, R is the average rate of star formation, and then the fraction of those that have planets, and the number of those planets that could support life, and the number of those where life actually does develop, and then the number of those where it becomes intelligent, and the number of those that develop a technology that could send a detectable signal out into space, and it just kind of funnels down, right? And says, kind of, here's the likelihood of making contact with another civilization. There's a Drake equation of OER, right? When you need an open educational resource on a specific topic or some group of learners, first, you have to hope that someone else somewhere has created that resource. Then you have to hope that they openly licensed it. Then you have to hope that they published it online where Google can find it, or they put it in a repository with decent metadata. Then you have to hope that Google actually has indexed it, or that you can providentially stumble upon the repository where it happens to be stored. And then finally, you have to hope that in all the searching that you do, you will actually locate the resource via Google or in that repository. That's how it works today. But with generative AI, when you need a resource on a specific topic or at a specific reading level or in a specific language or using specific examples, you prompt generative AI and it creates it. But that's the difference between kind of traditional OER and trying to find a resource that you need that way versus finding one with generative AI. So generative AI increases access, I mean, to resources, the topics that they might be on, the languages they might be written in, the examples they might use, the pedagogy that might be embedded. It can generate for us so many things compared to the number of resources that can be created by this kind of artisanal, handcrafted way that we've made OER in the past, which of course was the only option that we had for how to make it. So if we think about how generative AI has been impacting OER for the last couple of years, just to ground ourselves in what we mean by OER, this is another bingo card item for you. I'll always define OER at some point in the talk. Teaching, learning, and research materials that either reside in the public domain or have been released under an open license that permits their free use and repurposing by others. So this is articles, chapters, essays, textbooks, images, et cetera, et cetera. Well, generative AI is already profoundly affecting the way that these traditional OER are authored and the ways that they're revised and remixed. So before generative AI, we had to handcraft everything. With generative AI now, we can use generative AI to create drafts in literally orders of magnitude less time, by which I mean really, truly look at what the time was before and divide it by 10 or more than 10 to see how much time you could save using generative AI to produce that first draft. And because that's true, I think it's true that philanthropists and others who want to be effective stewards of funding will likely start requiring people who ask for money to create new OER to draft using AI and then do human follow-up, quality review, peer review, etc. But there's no reason to spend 6 months writing a first draft by hand today. Thinking about revising and remixing, like open licenses make it legal to revise and remix, but they don't give you the resources or the expertise that you need to do the revising and remixing. So if you have a Spanish that needs resource, if you have a student who needs resource in Spanish and you don't speak Spanish, having permission to translate it into Spanish is great. But if you don't have that expertise, then there's a gap, right? Or creating interactive resources or adjusting the reading level of a text. Generative AI can perform tasks like these for people that don't have the time or the expertise to do it themselves. And research has shown, and again, receipts are in the slide notes, that the more time and effort is required to engage in a specific kind of revise or remix, the less often users will do it. I mean, that makes total sense, but it turns out that it's true. For example, you're far more likely to delete a chapter from an open textbook than you are to make extensive revisions to an existing chapter. So inasmuch as generative AI makes these kinds of tasks faster and easier, I think we should expect to see more revising and remixing in the future, and that should be exciting. Research has also shown that, and again, uh, research has shown, you'll find in the slide notes there, the productivity gains associated with using generative AI are the highest among lower skilled workers, which should make a lot of sense. If you don't have the skill, then you're going to gain the most from using generative AI. So to come back to this translation example, using generative AI to translate a text will be far more helpful to somebody who doesn't speak the language than to someone who does. Even for the person who does speak the second language, it will make it faster, but there will be even more benefit gained by the lower skilled person. So in as much as generative AI makes these kind of tasks possible that were either previously impossible or impractical, we ought to see an increase in the variety of revising and remixing that happens, as well as the quality of that revising and remixing. And that should be pretty exciting too. Um, Before we get to the end of our time together here, actually, Delmar, are we done at 1/2 past or are we done at the hour?
We are done in 30 minutes technically,
Oh, in
but
30. Okay.
that includes question and answer, so you can
Okay,
decide.
perfect. There should be time for that. Awesome. So how generative AI, so we just talked about how it is affecting OER. Let's talk about how it could impact OER. So I want to try to persuade you to think about a new category of thing, a thing that kind of comes into existence when you combine generative AI and OER. And for lack of a better term, I'm going to call that generative OER. So generative OER aren't things that are designed like we saw in our traditional OER definition. They're not designed to be used directly for teaching, learning, or research. They're designed to be used as part of a generative AI system in order to create OER that adapts to learners in real time. So by generative OER, what I mean are things like openly licensed prompts and openly licensed model weights. And today, when you think about OER, you probably think about open textbooks. You think about, um, well, honestly, for most people, textbooks is the first thing that they think about. So this is a little different paradigm to think about a prompt being an OER. But that's what I want to try to persuade you to think about here, to think about these generative OER. So let's take openly licensed prompts for a minute. So many of the prompts that are written by kind of novice users of generative AI are relatively simple, like write an essay about the causes of this war. But the kind of prompts that you write to elicit more complex behavior from the model, like an extended tutoring session uh, that's going to use a specific kind of pedagogy, and maybe use specific examples. A prompt like that can be hundreds or thousands of words long, and you can find plenty of examples of these online. But once something gets to be hundreds or thousands of words long, guess who shows up again? It's our good friend, the Berne Convention, meaning that now that these prompts that we're writing are automatically copyrighted to the full extent of the law. And so to be able to share them with each other and give each other permission to copy them, revise them, remix them, we need to openly license them. And open prompts matter for a lot of the same reasons that having openly licensed educational resources matter, right? We understand how important it is to be able to localize traditional OER either for linguistic reasons or cultural reasons or pedagogical reasons or other reasons. We're going to need to be able to revise and remix prompts for generative AI systems for all of these same reasons. So it's important that as we're creating these prompts that facilitate these adaptive learning experiences, that we're openly licensing them, right? It's also true that users will choose to use different generative AI models for a range of reasons. Maybe your school has a partnership with OpenAI, so your students can use ChatGPT at no cost, but maybe my institution has a partnership with Microsoft, and so my students are using Copilot. And these different models respond in subtly different ways to the same prompt. So I need permission to localize the awesome prompt that you wrote so that it will work effectively with the model that my students are going to be using. So again, open licensing, open sharing, the humility of saying, this is what worked for me, but I'm going to put an open license on it because only you know what really works for you. And I want to give you that permission. I want to help you support your students as effectively as you can. All of that applies to prompts the same way that it applies to textbooks or essays or any other kind of resources. Now, open weights. And for those of you who care, I'm purposefully skipping over the debate about open models. I'm just talking about model weights. Okay, so model weights are conceptually similar to the beta weights that you would get when you do a linear regression. A model weight is a number, like this number here on the screen. And when we talk about model weights, what we mean are the thousands of matrices that contain the billions of these numbers that, when brought together, comprise the brains of something like a large language model. And open weights are when these weights have all been licensed in a way that give us permission to engage in the 5R activities. Well, copy and redistribute are easy enough, but what do retain and revise and what do revise and remix mean in this context? Let's just say a couple words very quickly. So revising when it comes to open model weights might look like quantization. Okay. And you'll remember the difference between revise and remix is that revise is about making changes to an individual resource, editing that resource. And quantization is kind of conceptually similar to rounding, right? You take like this long number and you shorten it to a much shorter number. It's not actually rounding, but it's conceptually similar. And quantization reduces the size of a generative AI model. It also makes it dumber, unfortunately, but it reduces the size of the model. And the reason that's important is because now, once the model is small enough, you can download it and run it on your own computer. You can even download it and run it on your phone. And we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. Um, you'll remember the difference between revising and remixing is that remixing is taking two or more existing things and combining them into a new resource. So when we think about open model weights, fine tuning is an example of what remixing would look like. And this is where I go and I curate a new collection of data and I bring those data to an existing model and I use it to retrain or update the training of that model because I want to change its behavior in a specific way. So, for example, if I had some open model weights like the ones that OpenAI released yesterday, I could download those, and then I could fine tune them using a data set I'd curated of 10,000 examples of interactions between a student and an expert tutor. And when that fine tuning process was done, the model would behave more like an expert tutor after having learned from these 10,000 examples. There's another version of that called distillation, which is it's also fine tuning, but it's where the data are generated by a larger, more capable model. And that larger model generates the data that you then use to retrain or to fine tune the smaller model. And that can transfer knowledge and behavior and capability from the larger model into the smaller model. So revising and remixing definitely still matter in the worlds of models and model weights, right? Foundation models aren't designed to behave pedagogically. They just give you the answer and try to make you happy. They can lack the disciplinary knowledge or the cultural knowledge or other information that we need them to have. And prompting and things like context engineering can temporarily improve the way a model behaves or the things that a model knows. But if you want to permanently change what a model knows or how it behaves, you have to fine tune it. And quantization and pruning and other kinds of changes are necessary if we want to run generative AI models on consumer hardware. Now, I don't know how many of you have done this, but there are a lot of tools that are available that make this really easy to do. My favorite is one called LM Studio. But you can actually download these open source model weights to your computer. And then, say if you're on a laptop, you could you could unplug from the network, put your laptop in airplane mode. You're not connected to the Wi-Fi, not connected to anything, and you can use that large language model on your own device, running there without sending data out to anywhere or anybody being able to see what you're doing or track what you're doing or anything. So being able to customize and run these models locally is really important. It improves privacy, decreases energy consumption because now I'm not doing this all up in the cloud. I'm just doing it on my laptop. And it addresses other issues like equity and access because if I live somewhere where there is no internet connectivity, I just don't get the benefit of using generative AI until someone takes one of these smaller models that maybe they've fine-tuned and they've given me a bunch of open prompts together with that and they put it on a thumb drive and send it to me in the mail. And now, without any access to the internet, I'm able to use generative AI in support of my learning. So being able to run models offline locally is super important in terms of equity and access to the benefits of generative AI for learning. I'll point you to just a couple of kind of what I would say are kind of early repositories here. If you want to see examples of some of the kinds of prompts I'm talking about, the library at Wharton is a great one. There's a very extensive one associated with my essay feedback. Um, so those are two places you could go. If you've never seen, a 1,500 word prompt and the ways that it goes about trying to facilitate one of these adaptive or personalized learning experiences, I think it would really be a benefit to you to go look at some of them. And then in terms of a directory of open model weights that you can go download, Hugging Face is the place to go for those. And again, I'll have a QR code at the end if you want to grab these links and go look at them. So let's say a couple of quick words about how generative OER impacts pedagogy or how they impact pedagogy. Um, we've talked about the internet and open licenses and generative AI. I think you can look at those in terms of affordances and have a pretty interesting kind of thought exercise. So the internet kind of famously removed time and place as barriers to education. The internet made it so that you could take your class at home at midnight in your bunny slippers, right? That's kind of the famous impact of the internet, removing time and place as obstacles or barriers. OER remove copyright restrictions, which mean that now we're able to do a number of things in support of teaching and learning that we couldn't do before. And both of those changes were uh, associated with some evolution of our pedagogy. I would suggest to you that if the internet removes time and place as barriers and open licenses remove copyright restriction as barriers, that generative AI removes access to expertise as a barrier. And so, how will pedagogy evolve in response to that? And by access to expertise, maybe the canonical example here would be I'm the aforementioned person in my bunny slippers at home at midnight doing an assignment, and I run into a problem that I can't solve. There's something I don't understand. I can't make any progress. I'm stuck until I'm able to get this question answered. And obviously, my instructor's not online at midnight. And if they are, they're not answering my question. Neither's my TA. Neither's my friend from study group. So I'm just stuck where I am until one of those people becomes available tomorrow, hopefully at some point. Well, if I can take that question and ask it to generative AI, get an explanation, get a second explanation, get a third explanation with a different example, finally understand what's going on and get unlocked and be able to continue doing my homework, that access to expertise makes a huge difference. And I think our pedagogy will evolve in some way in response to that. I've been talking for, gosh, I don't know, a decade about OER enabled pedagogy, which is kind of at least in the article, we said it's the set of all teaching and learning practices that are only possible or practical when you have permission to engage in the 5R activities. In other words, OER enabled pedagogy is the things you can do with OER in support of teaching and learning that you cannot do otherwise. So, for example, something I've done, maybe you've done this too, is have students revise, remix, and republish their course materials, both to improve their own understanding and to better support next semester's students. That's something you can do with OER that you can't do with TCM. I think there's something analogous here with generative AI. So just to be short in writing, I've said Gen AI, but generative AI enabled pedagogy. And this would be the set of things that you can do in support of teaching and learning when everybody has access to generative AI that you can't do when they don't. So one example of that would be we typically don't assign synchronous collaborative activities to students who are in asynchronous online courses because those activities are synchronous and we've advertised the courses as being asynchronous. But if generative AI can play the part of my partner, my discourse partner, now I can do a think, pair, share. I can assign a student in a fully asynchronous online course to do a think, pair, share activity with AI as the collaborator, right? So now activities that require a collaborator can be done at any place and any time, whereas they couldn't without generative AI. So that's an example of the kind of thing I mean when I say things you can do with generative AI that you can't do otherwise. And I think we aren't appreciating this at all yet, and I think it will be several years before we do. But capturing and expressing our pedagogy explicitly in prompts, as well as in fine-tuned open weights, it reifies our pedagogy in a way that lets us share, analyze, replicate for purposes of research, evaluate teaching approaches in a way that we've never been able to do that before. And I think that is incredibly exciting. The replication crisis of research in psychology is nothing compared to the replication crisis of research and education because we never describe the most important things like the instructional design of the materials. Being able to really document all of that in a clear way, in a lengthy, explicit prompt is going to enable new kinds of work that we have not been able to do before. And I want to say here that I am not claiming that every pedagogical technique can be implemented through generative OER, but many of them will be able to be, and it's going to be very exciting. And as I was thinking about this point, I remembered a point that my PhD advisor used to beat into us all the time. He used to talk about productizing things. And in this case, I think there's an exciting opportunity for us to productize evidence-based practices. So let me give you an example of productizing. So I don't understand, and I expect that most of you don't understand the technical differences between the 4G and the 5G wireless standards. And you don't have to. 5G is just built into your phone in such a way that you benefit from higher speeds without needing a master's degree in information theory. You don't care what the differences are or how they work. You just know that if you use something that has that built in, you get faster downloads. Okay. So similarly, most instructors and students are unaware of the large body of research into evidence-based teaching and learning practices. But they don't have to be if we could build these practices into generative OER. Then, when you sit down and engage in one of these adaptive learning experiences, you can benefit from doing more effective things with your time because the system is taking you through the process of doing those more effective things. You don't need to know what they are, what their names are, who first discovered them, what the research says. You don't need a master's in teaching and learning because we can productize those practices and embed them in a way that I can benefit from them without having to deeply understand them, name them, etc. And I think this is also super exciting. So I want to ask you, I'm gonna shut up for just a minute. Um, and then we're almost done. We'll have some time for Q&A. But I want you to think about a course that you teach and imagine that if resources, time, money, if there were no constraints whatsoever, and you could do anything you wanted to with your students, what kind of learning experience would you design for them if there were no constraints? And there's not enough time now to finish this exercise, but I would invite you to ponder on this. If there were no constraints, like in the perfect world, what would you helping your students learn about your discipline? What would that look like? And I propose to you that generative AI can get you closer to that ideal than you are today. It won't get you all the way there, but it can get you closer to there than what teaching and learning in your class looks like today. And I'd invite you to think about how that might be true. So just to conclude, and then we'll have 10 minutes of time left for Q&A. This notion that technologies democratize, and by democratize, I mean they make so much easier, so much cheaper. They make it possible for people with, you know, people who are unable to really dedicate a lot of time developing a lot of skill. These technologies democratize activities that we care about and that are valuable. The internet democratized publishing and broadcasting. Open licenses democratize sharing. Generative AI democratizes the authoring of adaptive learning experiences. And each of these advances and the democratization that comes with them gives us a greater capacity to increase access to educational opportunity and to improve outcomes. And I think because that's true, I think we have an obligation to our students to use them, to figure out how to use them effectively. So my challenge to you is to think about, as you think about OER and the way that you use OER and engage with it, think about increasing access, but also think about improving outcomes. And let's be in love with these two problems and not be in love with our solution of the last quarter century, which is traditional OER. I'm not saying that there's no room for it at all. I'm just saying that think about these problems and try to reimagine a solution given everything that we have access to now. We can create personalized, adaptive learning experiences more easily than ever before with generative OER. And the encouragement I have for you is that when you create traditional OER, when you fire up Pressbooks or whatever it is, and you get in there and start drafting your open textbook, you're just typing words, right? When you create open prompts, you're just typing different words, right? You can't write a textbook without knowing something about your discipline, without knowing something about pedagogy, without knowing something about the way that teaching and learning work. If you know those things, to the extent that you know those things, you could be creating open prompts as well. You're just typing words. The open weights part of it gets more complicated. I appreciate and I understand that. But I just want to encourage and hopefully inspire you to feel like you can do this. You can absolutely create these generative OER, which are the place where generative AI and OER kind of overlap and intersect each other. And I think give us a much greater opportunity both to increase access and to improve outcomes than either of them alone can. And that's my talk. Thank you. I'd love to do some question and answer now. I've purposefully not been looking at the chat. It's too hard to try to read that and talk to you at the same time. So I'll scroll back through the chat, but would love to hear what you're thinking, to hear arguments, disagreements. Heaven forbid, somebody who thinks I might be on the right track.
Well, it's
Um,
my job to go through the chat, so you don't have to, at least
Very good.
point they hear. So there are a handful of questions that came up, and I encourage anyone who has further questions to throw them into the chat, and I am happy in order to be the bridge, or you can take on. So let me start with one issue that was not really discussed in the topic of Gen AI, which has to do with efficacy and whether
Mhm.
Gen AI is really at the level of being able to do what we want it to do because of all the issues that we have with hallucinations slash mirages that are intrinsic to the way large language models operate. The second corollary to that question is, can you comment on the efficacy on the local large language models versus the OG versions that are available online?
Yeah, awesome. Great questions. As I mentioned, and I'll answer those in reverse. The local models are always going to be dumber than the models that you're running in the cloud because the models that you're going to run locally are going to need 16 gigs of RAM, maybe to fit into and be able to operate. Whereas the kind of thing that you're using when you use ChatGPT, heaven only knows how big and how much more complicated and specific and nuanced that model is than the one that you're able to compress down and run locally on your machine. So the more specific, well, no, let me just stop there. Uh, so your local model is always going to be dumber. The question is, at what point do the local models become smart enough that they're acceptable? Um, I think it's an unfair criticism of large language models to complain about the fact that they're not very good pedagogically. They don't know all the things we wish they knew about the specifics of our discipline, etc. Because if you just went out on the street and grabbed a random person, you wouldn't expect them to know pedagogy. You wouldn't expect them to have the same level of mastery of chemistry as Delmar has, things like that. Delmar went through a lot of additional training to develop the expertise that he has, both in chemistry, in pedagogy. You don't just pull a random person off the street and get, you know, be surprised by the fact that they don't have a set of specialized skills that you wish they had. Um, I think if we want to use generative AI for educational purposes, we have to put them through the same kind of additional training that we would put any kind of reasonably, just take a general human and say, I want you to do this specialized task. They're going to need additional training to be able to do that task effectively. So, the idea that as educators that we're going to be involved in the process of writing prompts that are thousands of words long that explain here is the pedagogy that I want you to employ. Here's what it looks like. Here are 3 or 4 examples of what that pedagogy looks like playing out in a discourse between a make-believe AI and a make-believe student, so you can see examples of how it works. Here are clear directions. Um, to get these models to do what we want them to do, they really need explicit support and training. They're not going to do what you want them to do just out of the box. And the idea of the old idea, garbage in, garbage out, absolutely. applies here that a half-baked prompt that you take 4 minutes to write that's 3 sentences long is probably not going to get you the results that you want. And I would not chalk that up to deficiencies in the model. You can provide additional context, you can provide additional examples, you can provide additional training um, to get these models to perform at a very high level. Are they ever going to be perfect? No. Is any human ever going to be perfect? No. I probably misspoke a dozen times during the talk, and you might have been annoyed by it and maybe even confused. Um, but the question is, can we get them to perform at an acceptable level? And I think the answer to that today is with a lot of work and effort, yes. And 6 months from now, it'll take less work and effort, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so don't expect any generative AI model to perform like a master teacher unless you do some similar kind of training with it. Delmar, am I making any sense at all? Asking you to speak on behalf of the entire group.
No, it's great. You answered that. Let me transition to a comment that Jim Julius mentioned, which is sort of a big picture. Is there any chance that the open community, especially in academia, will develop actual open AI systems so that we're not forced to use opaque, inequitable AI systems from tech oligarchs?
Well, I would, if I had to bet one way or the other, I would say no. The amount of money that it costs to do that training is significant. I'm not sure who would provide that. If you were going to limit your training data to only data that were openly licensed, you you decrease the volume of things that your model can read by 99 point some percent. Um, I think there are all kinds of difficulties. I understand like why it's desirable. Um, if all the research in the world were openly licensed tomorrow and we could go grab all of it and use it uh, ethically for model training because it's openly licensed, except I know there will be some people here that'll say, actually, openly licensed isn't enough. You need to explicitly ask my permission if model training was what I had in mind when I applied an open license to my work. Like there's all kinds of weeds over there. And then there's just the $100 million that it takes to train even a reasonably sized model. And who's putting that up? Is it Hewlett? Is it Gates? Is it the Department of Ed? Like, where's that $100 million coming from to do that training? I would love to be wrong about that, but like, if you were forcing me to put money down on one side of the table or the other today, I would guess the answer is no.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Ronald Slabanik. Um, Don't know if this will be addressed, but what strategies can help mitigate risk occurrences of biases in general, generative AI, and obviously applied to the OER version you were talking about?
Yeah. Well, what do we do when we want to decrease incidents of bias and stereotype and other offensive behaviors by people in our organizations? We train them. That's how we reduce that. We don't expect everyone to come off the street kind of ready to do all of that and have all those skills and be capable. We provide professional development that might be optional, it might be mandatory. And so, again, as you're developing these generative OER, that's something that you can include in the training, whether it's like training like by means of fine tuning, or if you're just doing a lot of kind of context engineering, you can include non-examples, examples, guidelines. You can include those things in the prompts that you write, the behaviors that you want. If you want to make sure that those behaviors are there, it's up to you to ask for them in the prompt that you write. But just in the same ways that we require people in the workplace to go through trainings in order to avoid being, saying stupid things or offensive things that might be biased or whatever. It's the same approach with these models. They need training.
One final question before we end this thing out. And you touched upon it briefly, and that's the ethics associated with Gen AI, which is something that underlies the whole use of openness, which is fact that 99 point X% of the content that's trained in AI is copyrighted, and irrespective of whatever legal implications are in terms of defining that as useful. What concerns do you have about the community using stuff that might be considered unethical, um, but where using fully ethical OER, irrespective of also permissioning that you mentioned, is just not good enough in order to be able to move forward with that.
I guess it really comes down to a question of what you think is ethical or not. Um, and I think that's probably where I would disagree. Well, I'm sure I disagree with some people on this. Like the idea that I might read something, learn from it, and then go apply what I had learned through reading, even if the thing that I read is copyrighted, that doesn't seem crazy and unethical to me. A number of years ago, there was a professor at a university in Florida who sued several of his students because the students had been in class, had been taking notes in class, and then started making those notes publicly available. And the professor said, those notes are a derivative work of my copyrighted lecture that I presented in class. And as a derivative work, I control their distribution, not you. And I wondered, well, what would happen if one of those people got a job and on the job they performed some skill where they actually used the information they'd been taught, and a person watching them could reverse engineer the information that had been presented in that lecture just by observing their behavior? Like, is that inappropriate too? Like the whole enterprise of education, this is another soapbox I've been on for a long time. Education is sharing, right? The most successful educator is the educator who shares the most completely and thoroughly with the largest percentage of their class. And the idea, and I know people have strong other feelings about it. I'm just telling you how I feel about it. The idea that a student or a machine, it seems to me to only be a difference of scale, might read things that are copyrighted, internalize, learn those things, and then turn around and write something new or create something new, incorporating what they had learned from that process of reading and study. That doesn't seem unethical to me, regardless of the scale at which it happens. I know other people feel strongly in different ways. I acknowledge that. And I don't think they're crazy. I think that's a totally reasonable perspective to have. That's just my perspective on it. So before you can even get into the question that was actually asked, I think you have this prior issue of, what is ethical in this space.
Hmm. With that, we can close this thing out. Let's thank David Wiley. I'm not sure how you clap on Zoom, but I will just thank you very much for a very engaging keynote presentation here and a great start to this year's Cal OER meeting. Uh,
Well, again, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciated the opportunity to share and spend a little time with you.
you gave us a lot of stuff to chew on. With that, we have a 10-minute break before we start our first breakout session, which happens at 10 o'clock California time. So I encourage you to move around a little bit, and then we'll get going with that. Thanks everyone for attending.